Dustin Paschal here for Simon Paschal Says yet again. Today we're going to talk about the Americans with Disabilities Act, and particularly what we're going to talk about is the aspect of it that maybe employers sometimes forget about or aren't as careful with, and that is the regarded as aspect of the ADA. And so what I'm talking about there is under the ADA, we all understand that individuals with disabilities or that affect a major, substantially limit a major life activity are protected under the ADA. But there's also a protection for people that are not disabled, but who the company, the employer, regards as disabled or treats as disabled. So essentially, if you, the employer, treat an employee or regard them as disabled, you kind of cloak that employee with protection under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Now, that doesn't cloak them with the protection for reasonable accommodations, but it would give them protection for adverse employment actions. If you terminate them because you are treating them as disabled or believe they are disabled, even though they may not be, they would have a cause of action against you potentially under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so, that's one aspect, but what often happens is employers are a little less careful. They understand that that is a thing and that is something they should avoid, but they're a little lackadaisical with it, so to speak. And so I wanted to kind of talk about some tips for how to avoid those regarded as claims. And so a very basic example or tip is to avoid comments or questions that indicate you perceive or you regard the employee as disabled. And so kind of that basic example is, instead of asking an employee who seems to be having some issues at work, "Are you depressed?" you want to say, "Are you okay?" And that seems minor, but by saying, "Are you depressed?" the employee may be able to argue that you believe they are depressed, and depression is a covered disability under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So instead of saying, "Are you depressed?" say, "Are you okay?" And then when it comes to discipline for an employee, we want to focus on the performance or the behavior of the employee rather than the underlying cause. Because when we focus on that underlying cause, that's when we start to move into these regarded as claims. And so another couple of examples are, instead of saying, "You seem to have a drinking problem," what you want to say is, "You've been late to work 5 times in the last 2 weeks." And so you see there, instead of focusing on the underlying cause, or instead of focusing on that, drinking is the problem, you're focusing on the performance, the behavior. You've been late to work. That's the performance, rather than what you believe may be causing it. Another example, kind of going back to that depression, is, instead of saying, you seem to be depressed, you should get some help, you want to focus again on the behavior and say something more along the lines of, "We've received complaints that you've been very short with coworkers lately." And so while you're still kind of getting to that same issue, you're still getting to, something's wrong with the employee, rather than cloaking them with protection by saying you seem to be depressed and trying to focus on the cause of it, focus on the behavior. "We've received complaints that you've been short with coworkers." And so if you can kind of follow those tips and just be careful with your language, you're better able to avoid those regarded as claims under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So there's a little tip for you today on Simon Paschal Says, and we will see you next time.